Welcome. My name is Bob Tickleman, and I'm excited to be your guide for AZ-500, Microsoft Azure Security Technologies, and we're on the learning path for securing compute, storage, and databases. In previous recordings, we covered the first two modules, and we're now on the module for planning and securing Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instances. Whether it's a SQL Server running on an IaaS virtual machine, either in Azure or on premises, whether it be a SQL database or a SQL managed instance as a platform as a service where the underlying operating system is managed by Microsoft, they basically are all the same. We're going to focus on the SQL Server portion and the data itself. So whether it's a database that you're managing, all the management of the underlying SQL Server, that's on you. That's been covered in other recordings when we take a look at managing and securing infrastructure. The same thing is going to happen here. Whether it's a SQL database, which is a PaaS offering where you don't even have to have a SQL instance. If any of you are familiar with the product SQL, you actually have Windows Server, you install SQL on top of that server, and that's called a SQL instance. That SQL instance can host multiple databases on it, so that's the variation. So we're having a managed instance where you have a SQL server for all intents and purposes running on a Windows server that is managed by Microsoft. You don't get to manage SQL Server, you get the management plane of the SQL Server. If you're familiar with the SQL Management Console, you're going to get all that capability to manage, those kind of features. A SQL database says you don't have to worry about all the management of the SQL Server of creating rules and backup policies and all that. You're just going to get the database itself. So it's a very, very lightweight, easy to work with and deploy, especially if you're spinning up, say, test environments. You need just a database very quickly and destroy it. You just need a database. I don't need the entire instance. So that full plethora, we're going to take a look at the management of the data regardless, because at the end of the day, a table's a table with data exactly across all three of them. Now, this has been referenced in other recordings, but that circle on the right-hand side really covers a topic referred to as defense in depth. I've mentioned this a number of times, and at the core of any security planning, you want a defense in depth model. And it gets everything from physical access security all the way down to, from our perspective, we want to have that network security, which is covered in other recordings. We've talked about how to secure your VNets and how to give access, whether it be public or private access, all covered in other recordings. But you want to make sure you have network access to the SQL Server blocked down. We then take a look at the next ring where we're going to get into access management. That's that identity piece that was covered in other recordings in this series. We then take a look at threat protection and looking at antivirus and taking a look at attack surfaces. And that's going to get into some of the infrastructure components that you have of the physical server that is hosting the environments, whether it be your hosted or hosted by Microsoft. We emit all that information. Take a look at that. And now we're going to focus on information protection and the customer data classifications within SQL. So that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time focusing. SQL has the ability to interact with either local SQL accounts, so you would actually create an account on the SQL instance or the SQL server that you would build the instance on, not so much with the database version, but you now have the ability to actually interact with Microsoft Entra IDs for the authentication that you would then authorize within your SQL Server. And so that's what they're showing you right here, is the ability to enable and select which SQL or which Microsoft Entra IDs are going to have access to the infrastructure and the internal workings of the SQL Server and the data that's within it. Now, they show at the bottom of the slide, they talk about Microsoft Purview. We're going to take a look at Purview in just a few minutes for the data classification of the data that's hosted on either the database or the SQL instance. So Microsoft Purview, as part of a suite of cloud-hosted services, Microsoft Purview has the capability to go out, and you're going to see how we register sources. We can go out and analyze the information that exists in those locations and then classify that information. So based around the information, I think there's over 300 pre-configured identifiers that are in Purview, and you can customize and add some of your own. So things like national identity managers, your social security number in the United States, your social insurance number in Canada, credit card numbers. And so a lot of these standard or well-known identification information, identity information, secure information that you might want to protect, it can go through and identify that kind of information as it exists in documents, in your databases, and then identify that information in a report and say, I'm going to classify this, put a label on it so that we can then put a policy in place on how to manage that data itself. So that's basically Purview governance in a nutshell. We cover this in other recordings on this topic specifically, how to configure and operate Purview as your governance portal to manage the information classification and policies that you want to do to manage it. And so they're just walking you through the steps now to actually go through and register your data sources. So the first thing you need to do is log into the Purview portal. You have to have the appropriate licensings that are associated with Purview. And then what you do is you come in and then you identify, you're seeing that example on the slide, what data sources that you need. Now, hopefully you're going to then be using a Microsoft Entra ID that you might have. We've talked about service principal names that they're going to use to be able to access those registered data sources so that it at least has read capabilities of the data source itself. So it can ingest that information, provide the analysis against it, and then either come up with recommendations for the profiles that have been pre-configured or suggestions for other profiles based around maybe you've got project names that you have that you want to be able to identify those internal private project code names that you have. You can add that to the data classification, say find documents with Project Avalon, and then identify those documents so that we could then classify them and then put policies around to control and protect them. So after you've now configured the sources, you've given it access, you then go through the scan process, and this could take potentially quite a while for it to take place. They typically say, at least 24 hours. It just depends on the, network access, speed of access, the volume of data that you're dealing with, but you want to be able to make sure that you have a scan of that information. And then there's a regular ongoing basis that you can update that information. And then what you need to do is ingest that information. So this is just walking you through that process. And then you create the scan rule sets and looking for that kind of information. I mentioned that there's some default policies that are in place to look for information, or you can create your custom policies to classify and look for those characteristics or signatures that would indicate that that information exists in a document or a source location. You then have to apply the classifications that you're working with. So you've connected to the source, you've ingested the information, you've identified the information, and now you want to put a data classification against that. Classifications could be, public, private, secret, secure. You can actually put these different classifications so that we can then run policies against that to actually have a governance plane put against that data specifically. That's where we're going to get into some of this labeling. So this is just part of that whole Purview process where you're going to then build the data map. You can see the process. You've created the labels. You registered the assets. You scanned the assets. You had the classifications that were found, and then you labeled the data. So the nice things about the labels, it's not where the product lives. The label lives with the product or the object that was identified. So as that object gets moved around, the label for the object remains with it. So regardless of where it comes from, that label is going to stick with it once it's been classified. So one of the things that you might want to do, and this is now switching back to SQL. So we started off with SQL and how you could configure the SQL for monitoring. We then went to Purview to then identify the information regardless of the source. One of the sources you might want to register is your SQL. And now it's going to come back and possibly make recommendations around the data in your SQL server. In here, you may have columns of data that you're looking at that have credit card information. You might have columns with passport identity. You might have columns with birth dates. All of this information, if they follow a pattern, could be identified. And now you can provide data masking capabilities from, I need you to encrypt the entire column. I don't want that information seen by anybody. I want to lock it down so only certain people can see it. Now, common cases, and you might get this question when you call help desk, can you give me the last 4 digits of your social insurance number? Or can you give me the last 4 digits of your credit card? So you can mask the information to say, hey, I can have a help desk person query this information, but their classification is as a help desk user, they only get to see a masked version of it. So they might only see those last 4 digits of whatever the number might be. So this can now be applied at the SQL server to protect the data. Now we're going to look at other things. SQL can now provide, do you have the authentication? Do you even have an ID that allows me to even access the data in the SQL server? So that's not at this point. You've now authenticated. You're a help desk user. You've been identified. You've logged in as a help desk user. You've accessed the SQL server. It says, yes, you as a help desk user has the time and access to the information. And yes, you can have access to this field, but you're only going to get access to the data masked version of that information. We have a wide variety of encryptions that are available for the data. Now I'm going to go back to SQL stores its information in a MDF or master database file itself. Now that MDF exists typically on storage, durable, that might be blob storage or might be a disk, a file share storage. Now remember, just like we talked about in the storage encryption recording, all data in a storage account is going to be encrypted at rest. We have access keys to access that information. We have enter IDs that can access the information. We can double encrypt that information. There's all sorts of stuff done as just data. But once the MDF file, you can encrypt the MDF file that was on the disk in which the file was stored. So now I could have to decrypt the MDF file. Within the MDF file, the master database file, you might have multiple tables. I can encrypt entire tables. I can encrypt specific columns within that table. And we saw on the previous slide the ability to mask that information. So there's this whole level of transparent data encryption that we have available for us to be able to go in and encrypt information at different levels to be able to make that information secure. So we have regular encryption outside of SQL. Inside of SQL, we have transparent data encryption. We then also have a feature that calls always encrypted. Now, what this is going to do is, while we might encrypt the data, and you see on the left-hand side of the slide, we have the encryption at all these different levels at SQL. We talked about having encryption in flight so that as the information moves from SQL to your application, we want to make sure that it's transmitted securely. So that might be, depending on the network, it could be over VPN. So you're going to have tunneling protocols for encryption. It could be using with the HTTP or TLS for the transport level of encryption. But the always encrypted means that the information was encrypted in SQL, it stayed encrypted, it was secured, it was accessed securely, it was transported securely, and in the application, it is still encrypted securely. And this prohibits the application. If the application ever gets compromised, the data doesn't get compromised because it's still encrypted, but it's encrypted to the application. So a compromised version of the application may not expose that information. So that's referred to as always encrypted. Now there's a version of this that isn't talked about, but I'm going to give it to you that you may want to add, that you can monitor for it using your Microsoft Cloud's security benchmark. That is an end-to-end encryption. And so what in this case, you have SQL, you might have an app that's going to use the SQL that's going to go to the end user's location. Now this requires additional programming and potentially additional software to be installed at the client side. So you actually have a client computer that's accessing an app, that's accessing the data. I want that end-to-end encryption. Absolutely, it's an option. It's not talked about in this course, though. You might want to add that to your security features. When you take a look at that table level and the column level, this is just giving you some of the how it's done. So when you use the always encrypted features, you could actually do it down to a table. You can do it to specific columns. And what they're showing you here, it says you want to recommend this. And what you do is through the encryption wizard, the always encrypted wizard, you start off with that left or the right-hand side of the slide. You start it and you create a master key protects, and then you use that master key to protect the actual columns that you want. So the master key for the table then gives you the list of the columns in the table. You select which column you want it to encrypt. And so that way you can then store the master key in something like Key Vault that then uses to gain access to the column keys that you're working with. So you've got multiple keys that you need access to be compromised to be able to get around this. So just a looking at how you can have that layered approach in the defense in-depth model for managing your SQL data in a secure manner. Now, there is the capability, we've talked about that network component. We've talked about the network component in other recordings, but in this one, we're going to take a look at, and I've showed this again in other recordings, you could actually have a firewall around an Azure storage account. You could have a firewall around certain services. Now, you can actually have an Azure firewall we talked about at the networking level. The same thing now that we can add to this is we can add as a SQL database firewall as part of the SQL server itself, and this is showing you the configuration to protect the data, whether it be Synapse or Azure databases, that it's the database level IP filtering that you're going to be working to gain access to that information. So we've seen a wide variety of services that offer SQL capabilities, whether it be standalone SQL servers in a virtual machine. We didn't look at that one that closely, but it basically behaves the same as either a SQL managed instance, which gives you full-blown SQL and the ability to have multiple databases on that SQL instance, or if all you need is just a SQL database, you don't want all the fancy administration that goes with an instance, you can get just a standalone database. But what we really spent our time focusing on was the storage and security and access of that information inside the database itself. And we saw that different levels of authentication and authorization using Microsoft Entra IDs. We took a look at the always encrypted. We looked at transmission in flight. We looked at the end-to-end encryption as a way to secure that information. So that's the end of the recording of securing your SQL information. I look forward to seeing you at another recording.